Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is December 1st. On this day in 1972, a 38-year-old widow named Jean McConville disappeared from her home in West Belfast, Northern Ireland. For years, no one knew what happened. It would eventually come to light that Jean had been abducted, murdered, and buried in secret by the Provisional IRA, who accused her of being an informer for the British Army. But decades later, investigations would find no evidence she ever passed on any information. Today, we're discussing one of the most tragic and controversial cases of Northern Ireland's disappeared, the abduction and murder of Jean McConville. Let's get started. Jean McConville's story begins long before that December night in 1972. Born Jean Murray in 1934, she grew up in East Belfast in a Protestant family. As a young woman, she married Arthur McConville, a Catholic and former British Army soldier. Jean converted to Catholicism, and together they had 10 children. In 1969, tensions during the Troubles forced the McConvilles out of their Protestant neighborhood. They resettled in the Divis Flats in West Belfast, an area that quickly became an IRA stronghold and a constant battleground between Republicans and British forces. Then, in January 1972, Jean's world was shattered. Arthur died of cancer, leaving Jean to raise 10 children on her own. She was just 37 years old. The family's tiny flat at 1A St. Jude's Walk became a crowded sanctuary, with kids ranging from age 6 to 20. Her oldest son, Robbie, had already been interned at Longkesh as a member of the official IRA. Life in Divis Flats was difficult and dangerous. At one point, Jean was reportedly seen helping a wounded British soldier outside of her building. That single act of compassion sparked ugly rumors in the neighborhood, including whispers that Jean was informing to the British Army. On November 29, 1972, a British Army patrol recorded meeting a distressed woman in the street who identified herself as Jean McConville. She told them that she'd been attacked and warned to stop informing. Just days later, she would vanish. The exact date that Jean was abducted is still debated. Some of her children remember it as being the night after that street encounter. Others say it was up to a week later on December 7th, but most records list her disappearance and presumed death as December 1st. What we do know is that on a cold night in December, members of the IRA entered the McConville flat. Witnesses say that 4 young women took the lead, forcing Jean to leave with them at gunpoint. Years later, Dolores Price, a former IRA member, claimed in interviews that she helped drive Jean across the border into the Republic of Ireland. According to Price, McConville was taken to County Louth, where she was shot in the back of the head and secretly buried on Shelling Hill Beach. No one outside of the IRA knew where she was. Back in Divis Flats, the McConville children tried to survive on their own. Jean's 15-year-old daughter, Helen, did her best to care for her younger siblings, including 6-year-old twins. About 3 weeks after their mother's disappearance, a stranger knocked on their door. He handed over Jean's purse with a few coins and her wedding rings inside. It was the only real sign they would ever receive that their mother wasn't coming back. On January 16, 1973, the Belfast Telegraph ran a front-page story, "Snatched Mother Missing a Month." The next day, the children appeared on BBC Northern Ireland begging for help. After the broadcast, social services stepped in. The children were taken into care and separated. Her son, Billy, was placed in Roubaix House, a boys' home that would later be investigated for horrific abuse. He later described being starved and beaten there, saying, quote, Christians looking after young boys. Maybe they were Christians, but to me, they were devils disguised in that uniform." End quote. The trauma of losing their mother, of being called children of an informer, and of suffering abuse in state care would shape the rest of their lives. For years, no group admitted to taking Jean. In Republican circles, they said she'd been an informer and the IRA had dealt with her in the context of war. On the streets, people whispered that she had run off with a British soldier. It wasn't until 1999, more than a year after the Good Friday Agreement, that the IRA finally admitted responsibility. In a public statement about the disappeared, they acknowledged abducting, killing, and secretly burying Jean and 8 others. They claimed that she'd been paid by the British Army and that a transmitter was found in her home. Jean's children rejected the allegation outright. And in later years, IRA members gave conflicting accounts. Brendan Hughes claimed Jean confessed under interrogation. Dolores Price said she drove her across the border. Both alleged that senior Republican leader Jerry Adams had approved the operation. Adams has consistently denied any involvement and says Jean's murder was wrong. To this day, no one has been prosecuted. In the wake of the IRA's 1999 admission, efforts began to locate Jean's body, but search teams came up empty until August 2003, when a storm partially eroded a car park embankment at Shelling Hill Beach. A passerby noticed something in the sand: human remains. Forensic testing confirmed that it was Jean McConville. A postmortem showed that she'd been killed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. There were no other injuries. Her children identified her clothing. More than 30 years after she was taken, Jean was finally buried beside her husband. In April 2004, an inquest ruled her death an unlawful killing. In 2006, police ombudsman Nuala Oloan released a damning report into the original investigation. She found that the Royal Ulster Constabulary had essentially done nothing. There was no case file and no meaningful inquiry. The police later issued a full apology. Most importantly, the report concluded that there was no evidence Jean McConville had ever passed information to British sources. She was, the ombudsman wrote, an innocent woman who was abducted and murdered. Jean's story made headlines again in the 2010s because of the Boston College Oral History Project, which recorded confidential interviews with former paramilitaries. Transcripts were later handed over to the police. In 2014, Jerry Adams was arrested and questioned, but released without charge. That same year, veteran Republican Ivor Bell was charged based on those tapes, but in 2019, that case fell apart. The court ruled that the interviews were too unreliable to be used as evidence. On December 1st, 1972, Jean McConville was taken from her home and never returned. It would be more than 3 decades before her remains were found. But even now, the full truth remains buried. Her 10 children grew up without their mother. They were branded by rumor, broken by the system, and burdened with trauma they never deserved. Her family continues to fight, not just for justice, but for recognition that Jean McConville was not the enemy, and she was not a traitor. She was a mother, she was human, and she was innocent. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found Jean's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!